What's up, primates? I'm Shane the Skeptic, and I welcome you to the second video of my Epistemology series. Today, we're going to talk about knowledge, what it is, and what the necessary conditions for it are. To do this, we should probably begin by defining what we mean by knowledge, right? Intuitively, yes, but as you study epistemology, what you'll come to find is that not only is knowledge incredibly difficult to confidently arrive at, it's also surprisingly difficult to define in the first place. Anyone who wants to define knowledge in order to figure out just what it is faces an immediate problem, and that is figuring out just where to begin. You might be thinking that the problem I'm positing has an easy solution. Start simply by looking at cases in which we have knowledge and see what necessary conditions they have in common. So you might think of such paradigm cases of knowledge acquisition as the scientist who, upon conducting her experiments, correctly determines the chemical structure of the substance before her, or the key witness of a murder trial who knows the defendant is guilty because she saw him commit the murder in broad daylight. The problem with this suggestion, however, is that if one doesn't already know what knowledge is, for example, what the defining characteristics or what the criteria of knowledge are, then how can one correctly identify instances of knowledge in the first place? After all, we can't assume that we know what the criteria for knowledge are without thereby taking a definition of knowledge for granted from the outset. But at the same time, it isn't reasonable to think that we can correctly identify instances of knowledge without assuming knowledge of such criteria. Since without a prior grasp of these criteria, how are we supposed to correctly identify what is a genuine case of knowledge and what isn't? The problem regarding defining knowledge is known as the problem of the criterion, and it dates right back to antiquity. We can roughly summarize the problem in terms of the following two claims. I can only identify instances of knowledge provided I already know what the criteria for knowledge are, and I can only know what the criteria for knowledge are provided I'm already able to identify instances of knowledge. Clearly, this puts us in a dilemma in which no satisfactory approach is available to us. We must either assume that we can know what the criteria for knowledge are in order to identify instances of knowledge, or else we must assume that we can identify instances of knowledge in order to figure out what the criteria for knowledge are. The former approach is known as Methodism, and the latter, Particularism. I grab the second horn of the dilemma and approach knowledge from the particularistic approach. That is to say, I assume that I can identify instances of knowledge in order to establish what the criteria for knowledge are. And my best justification for this approach rather than the other one is that I'm able to rely on my linguistic intuition of the meaning of the word knowledge without having a precise definition of it established. With that in mind, let's look at some cases of knowledge we have and see what necessary conditions they have in common. If you're watching this video, you know that the internet exists. And if you understand what I'm saying, you know that you can speak, or at least understand, English. You know that 2 + 2 = 4, that Austin is the capital of Texas, and that all bachelors are unmarried male human beings who are old enough to get married. You might say you know the person you're watching and listening to in this video is in fact the same person from the previous video posted in the series. And some of you might say that you know that the chemical structure of water consists of 2 hydrogen atoms and 1 oxygen atom. In all of these cases, it's clear from the surface that in order for us to know any of these things, we must at the very least believe that they are true. Keeping in mind that to believe something simply means to be convinced that it is true. Though, sometimes we use the word belief in contrast to the word knowledge. So clearly, belief alone doesn't get us to knowledge. Also obvious, at least to me, is that in order for us to know any of these things, they must necessarily be true, as it goes against my understanding of the word knowledge to suppose that somebody can know something that is in fact not true. Can I know that Texas is in Canada, or that the moon is made out of cheese, despite these propositions being false? Of course not, so truth of the proposition is another necessary condition for knowledge. So belief and truth are 2 necessary conditions for knowledge, though obviously they aren't jointly sufficient, as it isn't at all difficult to think of cases in which somebody can believe something and be correct without their belief being knowledge. If you believe that you'll make it to work on time for no reason other than your favorite character of the last TV show you watched made it to work on time, then even if you do make it to work on time, you didn't know that you would prior to clocking in. However, could you, in the case of getting to work on time, know that you would if we added something else to the equation? Let's suppose that every day it takes you 20 minutes to get to work and you're scheduled to be at work at 8:30. Imagine in this scenario that you're leaving your house right at 8 o'clock with the goal of getting to work before 8:30. In this case, you have a justification for your belief that you'll make it to work on time. You know that every day so far it's taken you 20 minutes to get to work from your house. You know that it's 8 o'clock, and you know that 20 minutes after 8 o'clock is 10 minutes before 8:30, the time that you're scheduled to arrive at. So when you arrive at work on time, you probably feel like you knew you would from the moment you left your house. So here you had a belief, which was true, that you arrived at through the means of a justification. So, did you know that you'd make it to work on time? What if the next day you found yourself in the same place at 8 o'clock, leaving your house with a 20-minute commute ahead of you, and you're scheduled to be at work at the same time as the day before, 8:30. But, unbeknownst to you, an accident had occurred on the only route that you had to work, causing a 15-minute delay in your commute, leading you to arrive at 8:35. As we've already established, you couldn't have known that you were going to make it to work on time that day if it wasn't even true that you were actually going to. The question now is, the day before, where you were correct in your assessment that you'd make it to work on time, did you know that you would? You believed that you would, you had a justification for your belief that you would, and your belief was true. However, as was demonstrated by the second case, despite your justification, you still could have been wrong had there been some external variable such as an accident which you wouldn't have been able to know about prior to encountering it on your way to work. Some might argue that on the first day, where you made it on time, you knew that you would, since it was true that you would. And then on the second day, well, you couldn't have known that you'd make it to work on time because it wasn't even true that you did. However, in each of these cases, your level of confidence and justification was equal at the time of 8 o'clock. So, if the same confidence and justification was had at 8 o'clock each day, but in one of these cases an external variable changed the truth of the outcome, then in the first case, it was only because there were no external variables that you were correct, and thus you could have been wrong, leading me to conclude that you didn't actually know that you'd make it to work on time. You had a justification for your belief, but your belief was right by chance, as you couldn't have known of an external variable causing you to be wrong prior to encountering it. In conclusion of this video, belief, justification, and truth are necessary conditions for knowledge, but even jointly, they aren't sufficient. Can you think of a fourth necessary condition that might be jointly sufficient for knowledge? If so, leave a comment stating what that necessary condition is, and perhaps I might address it in the next video in this series. In the next video, we'll talk about justification and what it means in reference to belief and epistemology, and hopefully by the end of this series, we'll have a definition of knowledge established. But that's not a promise. To support this series, you can become a patron on patreon.com or make a one-time donation via PayPal. But for those of you who can't afford to help monetarily, please keep in mind that liking, subscribing, and sharing this video are all effective ways of supporting this series as well. I'm Shane the Skeptic, and I thank you for taking the time to watch my video. Stay safe, and please get vaccinated.